All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a completely fascinating journey into a radical, really paradigm-shifting idea. When most of us hear the word apocalypse, we immediately picture the literal end of the world, right? Fire, brimstone, global collapse, the whole shebang. But what if those ancient apocalyptic texts aren't actually predicting the destruction of the physical Earth at all? What if instead there are these profound, esoteric maps designed to guide our very own psychological and spiritual evolution? So let's dive right into this. What if the apocalypse isn't the end of the world, but the birth of the true self? It's an incredibly provocative question, isn't it? By shifting our perspective away from literal external doom and towards a process of deep personal transformation, we uncover a completely different narrative that's just been hiding in plain sight. Throughout this explainer, we're going to look at how Western Hermeticism, depth psychology, and inner alchemy interpret all these cryptic symbols.
To set the stage, let's think about this famous verse. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. Now, traditionally, this has often been read exoterically, as a call for harsh self-denial or, even self-hatred. But esoterically, it's an invitation. It's a direct invitation to deliberately relinquish your egoic identification. The self being denied here is just the psychological mask, the separate, desire-driven ego that actually believes it's completely isolated and in control. To be born again, well, that small self has to dissolve.
Okay, moving into section 1, Jezebel and the ego, the microcosm. Let's completely redefine a notorious figure here. In the book of Revelation, Jezebel isn't just a historical queen or some literal false prophet. She represents the internal voice of our own separate ego. She's that force inside us that degrades higher wisdom into just base cunning. She's the part that seduces our lower mind into worshiping physical form, sensory attachments, and these fleeting illusions of earthly power.
And it's brilliant to see how various esoteric traditions view this internal force. Gnostics, for instance, saw her as Sophia, or wisdom, corrupted. In Hermeticism, she's viewed as the unchecked lower astral desire body. Look at inner alchemy. There, she's vital creative energy directed downward into material bondage rather than upward toward true illumination. And the philosopher Rudolf Steiner? He had this totally fascinating take. He mapped her to a specific cultural age, the Greco-Latin epoch, seeing Jezebel as the ultimate temptation of pseudo-wisdom, where human consciousness was at a very real risk of becoming entirely trapped in physical sensory perception. Which brings us to section 2, Alchemy of the Soul, Overcoming Jezebel. So if Jezebel is our unrefined ego, how do we actually overcome her? In classical alchemy, the great work begins with what's called the Nigredo, or the blackening. The absolutely crucial point here is that this stage represents putrefaction and breakdown. In Revelation, Jezebel is threatened with being cast onto a bed of affliction. Now, esoterically, this is not physical illness, it's the Nigredo. It is a painful, chaotic, but absolutely essential stage of ego death, where our lower attachments and illusions of self-sufficiency just have to be burned away.
This is the alchemical cycle of renewal. First, you hit the Nigredo, the total breakdown we just discussed. But that leads directly to the albedo, a whitening and purification of the mind. And finally, you reach the rubedo, the reddening or solar rebirth, where spirit and matter completely unite. And why does this matter to you? Well, when you experience what feels like a crushing dark night of the soul, it's often just your personal Nigredo. The universe isn't destroying your ego out of malice. It's simply stripping it off its throne so your true higher self can actually be born from the ashes. Let's expand on this in section 3, Babylon and the global ego, the macrocosm. Now, we're going to dramatically scale up this narrative using the Hermetic principle of as within, so without. This reveals the incredible fractal nature of these texts. The exact same force is operating at two entirely different scales. On the micro level, we have Jezebel. That's the individual ego saying, I'm going to use my intellect and talents to satisfy my personal desire for comfort. But then on the macro level, we get the Whore of Babylon. This is society saying we're going to organize our entire global economy, culture, and power structures around the gratification of those individual desires. Babylon is simply the collective ego, built entirely on hypermaterialism. Just as individuals have egos, nations form collective egos too. These group souls are known as egregores. Revelation speaks of a victorious one who will rule the nations and dash them to pieces like pottery. Now, exoterically, that sounds pretty violent, right? But esoterically, pottery just represents matter baked into a rigid shape. A nation's rigid laws, its cultural superiority, its hard borders, that's the earthen vessel. For higher, universal truth and real unity to emerge, these brittle illusions of national self-sufficiency literally have to shatter. Sure, it's a bit rough for the pottery, but it's absolutely necessary for a united human race.
This sparks the crisis point in Section 4, the beast as catalyst, the global Nigredo. Think about that famous image of the whore riding the beast. In esoteric symbolism, the beast represents our untamed, primal, animalistic survival drives, things like fear, dominance, territoriality. The whore represents our highly sophisticated intellect and systems. But notice something crucial here. She doesn't elevate or transform the beast, she just harnesses it. Modern civilization uses technology and commerce not to spiritualize humanity, but to exploit our absolute most base animal instincts. As you can imagine, that creates a highly volatile societal balance.
And that volatility leads directly to this incredibly stark, brutal dynamic. The beast ultimately turns on the whore. Why? Because lower egoic drives are entirely rooted in self-preservation and division, so a civilization built on them literally cannot sustain itself. The raw, untamed forces eventually cannibalize the very economic and cultural systems that sought to exploit them in the first place. The beast is the ultimate catalyst here. The Great Tribulation is basically a planetary putrefaction where the illusion just collapses under the weight of its own instability.
Which brings us to a profound paradox in Section 5, the Black Sun's lights, the paradox of destruction. In alchemy, the agent that forces this whole Nigredo process is called the soul Niger, or the Black Sun. This is an intense, unnatural fire. To the dying, unrefined ego, this looks like absolute darkness, total death, and pure chaos. But in reality, the Black Sun is the invisible, uncreated light of pure spirit. It's only black because our limited human senses and lower intellect just cannot perceive it directly. It is the necessary bridge, heating up the planetary crucible so that the golden sun of real rebirth can finally rise. And drawing these cross-cultural connections is just fascinating. Across so many diverse esoteric traditions, total reality always appears terrifying to a fragmented mind. In the Western esoteric tradition, the soul Niger looks like total collapse to the ego. And over in the Vedic and Tantric traditions, the goddess Kali, the dark mother of time and space, appears as terrifying destruction to a soul bound by physical attachment. But to the enlightened practitioner, she destroys only the illusions that keep the soul trapped in suffering. Same exact concept, different tradition.
So you might be wondering, how do we end up seeing this completely natural process as evil? Well, it happens in 3 simple steps. First, separation. The ego desperately desires comfort and stasis. Second, fear. Because the ego only wants the creative, building up half of reality, it fears and violently rejects the destructive, dissolving half. And finally, the label. The fragmented mind experiences this necessary dissolution as a direct attack, so it demonizes it. But here is the massive aha moment. Destruction is just creation in reverse. The Black Sun only becomes an evil symbol when we view it through the incomplete, fearful lens of the lower ego. Finally, let's wrap this up in Section 6, the New Earth Reborn, the ultimate synthesis. Because as you'll see, the apocalypse does not end in annihilation. It ends right here with the descent of the New Jerusalem. It's described as a perfect cube, which perfectly represents Hermetic geometry, the squaring of the circle, the total spiritualization of matter. It is a divine chemical wedding, a global rebus where spirit and matter finally unite. And notably, the text makes a point to say there is no temple in the city. Why? Because the barrier between the sacred and the profane, between the internal and the external, has completely dissolved. Let's tie this entire narrative together. Think of it as a perfect fractal. The raw material, or prima materia, is your unrefined ego on a personal level, and it's Babylon on a global level. The Nigredo, that's your personal dark night of the soul, which exactly mirrors the global Great Tribulation. Then comes the albedo, the purification of your mind, perfectly matched by the cleansing of the earth. And finally, the rabido is the awakening of your higher self, perfectly paralleled by the descent of the New Jerusalem. It's the exact same process of awakening, just happening simultaneously on 2 different scales of reality. Which leaves us with this final, truly profound question. Are you ready to let your own earthen pottery be dashed to pieces so you can discover the indestructible gold within? The apocalypse isn't some future terrifying event to fear. It is an internal alchemy happening inside you right now. It is the painful yet incredibly beautiful shattering of who you thought you were, so that who you truly are can finally be born. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep learning, keep growing, and I'll see you next time.